When Henry Ravenshade opened his eyes, the world had no edges. Light swam in waves across the ceiling, blurred and distant, and the air smelled of damp earth and blood. Somewhere beyond the fog in his mind, someone was crying. The sound was quiet, held back, as though even grief had been taught to behave. He tried to move, but pain gathered at the base of his skull, sharp and deep. A voice spoke his name softly, so softly that he almost doubted he had one. Then a hand touched his face, trembling but careful, and a woman's breath brushed his cheek. "Henry," she whispered, "you are safe now." He blinked, and the blur shaped itself into the outline of a woman sitting beside his bed. Her face was pale from exhaustion, her hair drawn back, a few loose strands falling over her temples. Her eyes, grey-blue and tired, met his, and in them he saw a kind of desperate hope. He studied her carefully, as if recognition might come if he stared long enough. Nothing came. The memory of her face was a locked door. "Who are you?" he asked. The silence that followed was not long, but it felt endless. The woman's lips parted slightly, as though the question had taken something from her. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle, steady, but each word sounded like it had been forced through pain. "I am Eleanor." He waited, expecting more, a title, a reason, a memory, but she said nothing else. When he looked at her again, confusion turned to unease. The way she said her name, the way she looked at him, there was too much in it. He turned his gaze toward the window. Outside, rain fell against the glass in thin silver lines. The garden beyond was lost to the mist. "How long?" he said finally. "Have I been here?" 2 days, she answered. "You were found near the South Road. The horse returned without you." He nodded slowly, though the words meant little. His mind felt hollow, like a house without furniture. He knew his name, his estate, his habits, the shallow facts of a man's life, but there were no faces, no voices, no warmth. And the woman sitting beside him, with her trembling hands folded in her lap, was a stranger who seemed to have lost something far greater than he. The physician entered, his manner brisk and composed. He spoke of rest, of patience, of memory that might return or might not. Henry listened without interest. The moment the man left, the woman Eleanor rose as though to follow, then hesitated. "If you need anything," she said softly, "I will be nearby." He watched her walk to the door. Her movements were graceful, deliberate, but there was a heaviness in her posture, a weariness that made her seem older than she was. When the door closed behind her, the silence felt almost physical. That night, he dreamed of falling branches breaking, a cry lost to the wind. He woke before dawn, breathless, his pulse racing, the taste of rain still on his lips. The fire in the hearth had burned low. The only sound was the clock in the corner marking each second with merciless precision. He sat up slowly, pressing his palms to his temples. The room was unfamiliar, yet oddly comforting. The furniture was arranged with care, the curtains drawn back just enough to let in the first grey light of morning. Someone had placed a vase of white roses on the table beside him. The petals glistened faintly with dew, as if freshly gathered. When the door opened, he expected the physician. Instead, Eleanor appeared, carrying a tray with tea and bread. She set it down quietly, avoiding his gaze. "You need to eat," she said. He studied her again, searching for the thing that connected them. Her voice held the faintest tremor of intimacy, a tone one might use for someone beloved. Yet the way she moved, careful and restrained, was the way a servant might approach a master. He did not know which truth to believe. "Did we know each other?" he asked slowly. "Before the accident?" For the first time she met his eyes directly. The answer was there long before she spoke it. "Yes," she said. "We did." He wanted to ask more, but the words would not come. Something in her expression stopped him, a look, not of anger, but of quiet endurance. She poured his tea, her hands steady now, and left without another word. When the door closed, he reached for the cup she had left. The tea was still warm, faintly sweet, scented with honey. He did not know why that detail struck him so deeply, only that it felt familiar, like a memory he could not touch. Hours later, as evening crept through the room, he found himself wondering who she had been to him. A nurse? A friend? A lover? There had been no wedding ring on her hand. But something about her silence made him suspect that her loss was not professional. It was personal. He looked down at his own hand. A plain gold band glimmered on his finger. For a long time he stared at it, then at the closed door, and the truth that hovered at the edge of his mind began to take shape, terrifying, tender, impossible. He had forgotten her, and if the way she looked at him was any sign, She had not forgotten him at all. That night, as he drifted into uneasy sleep, her name echoed faintly in the space between waking and dreaming. Eleanor. The syllables felt old, worn, as if spoken many times in another life. He wondered, not for the first time, what kind of man forgets the only person who waits at his bedside, and somewhere deep within the quiet, the question formed that would not let him rest. When did I begin to lose her before the fall, or only after I forgot? Before the fall, before the silence, before memory itself began to unravel, there had been a day of celebration. The bells of St. Augustine's rang through the cold spring air, scattering sound across the cobblestones of London. Lady Eleanor Whitmore stood at the foot of the church steps, her hands clasped tightly around a bouquet of white lilies. She felt the world moving around her, the rustle of silk, the murmur of guests, the faint echo of her father's impatient sighs, but inside, she was very still. The Earl of Whitmore's debts had grown so heavy that whispers had begun to circle, even in polite company. The marriage he arranged for his daughter was not born of affection, but of necessity. The groom was wealthy, titled, and entirely respectable. Viscount Henry Ravenshade had inherited lands in the north and an impeccable reputation in business. Society admired his composure, his intelligence, and the calm severity of his manner. No one mentioned warmth, but then, warmth was not required in such transactions. Eleanor had met him only 3 times before their engagement. The first meeting had been brief, an exchange of formal courtesies at a dinner hosted by mutual acquaintances. She remembered the precision of his words, the slight inclination of his head, the way his gaze seemed to measure rather than see. The second meeting had been at an evening concert. They spoke of music, weather, and travel, all safe subjects that revealed nothing. The third meeting sealed the arrangement. Her father shook hands with him, her signature was placed beside his on a document, and the matter was concluded. Now, on the morning of her wedding, the chill of the marble beneath her shoes felt sharper than the cold air. She turned her head slightly, searching for something, perhaps a sign that this was not the beginning of her captivity. But her father's smile, wide and satisfied, left no room for such thoughts. "Hold your head high," he said. "You are about to secure our family's future." She obeyed. The doors of the church opened, and music began to rise. The aisle stretched long and white before her, and at the end of it stood Henry Ravenshade, motionless, his hands folded behind his back. He did not smile when she reached him. His bow was perfectly executed, his voice clear when he spoke the vows, each word delivered as if part of a contract being fulfilled. When her turn came, Eleanor's throat tightened. She spoke the words carefully, as if each syllable might cut her if she stumbled. The priest's voice carried on, and the ritual unfolded with practiced precision. When Henry lifted her veil and kissed her, his lips barely brushed hers, cold, brief, impersonal. Applause filled the church. She looked toward the faces of the guests but found no comfort there. Every smile seemed carved from expectation rather than joy. Her father looked proud. Henry's expression remained unreadable. The carriage that carried them away was lined with velvet, but Eleanor could not feel its softness. The air between them was heavy with politeness. Henry spoke of travel plans, of estate matters, of the efficiency of the servants awaiting them in the countryside. She listened, nodded, and said nothing of what she truly felt, that she was frightened, not of him, but of a life that had already decided her place before she had even stepped into it. When they reached Ravenshade Manor, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the gravel path. The house stood tall and perfect, a reflection of its master, impressive, orderly, and cold. Servants lined the entrance, bowing as they passed. Inside, the halls smelled faintly of polish and lavender. Paintings of ancestors watched them with unblinking eyes. Everything was beautiful, yet nothing felt alive. Henry led her through the grand hallway and stopped before the staircase. "You will find the rooms prepared," he said. "If you require assistance, Mrs. Linton, the housekeeper, will attend to you. Dinner will be served at 7. His tone was not unkind, but it left no space for intimacy. Eleanor nodded, unsure whether to thank him. When she looked up, he had already turned away. In her chamber, she removed her wedding veil and placed it upon the dressing table. The reflection in the mirror startled her. The woman looking back seemed older, her eyes too serious for her age. She wondered whether love was supposed to feel like this, quiet, heavy, restrained. The gown she wore, once the dream of her girlhood, now felt like an exquisite prison. That night, she sat by the window long after the candles had burned low. The garden below was a shadowed blur, the shapes of trees lost in darkness. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck midnight. She listened to the echo fade and realized that no one would come to her room, no footsteps, no voice calling her name. It was her wedding night, and she was utterly alone. Days became weeks, and weeks folded into months. The routines of the house were steady, predictable. Henry took his meals with her but spoke little. When he did, it was always courteous, always distant. She learned the tone of his politeness so well that she could hear it even when he said nothing. Once she asked him whether he had ever been to the sea. He looked at her as though the question were strange. "No," he said. "I find the endlessness of it unsettling." After that, she stopped asking him personal things. She began to find solace in the garden. The air there was softer, the silence less cruel. The gardener showed her the rose beds that his late mother had planted. The Viscount used to bring her here, the man said, every spring. Eleanor wondered whether he would ever bring anyone again. In time, she learned to keep her voice quiet, her movements gentle, as if loudness might offend the calm he required. The servants admired her composure. The townspeople spoke kindly of her grace, but no one saw the emptiness that grew each day behind her smiles. One evening, as she passed the study, she heard the faint scratch of Henry's pen. The door was half open. He sat at the desk, writing by candlelight, his profile sharp against the glow. She stood there for a moment, wanting to speak, to ask something simple perhaps what he was writing, perhaps nothing at all, but the words died before they reached her lips. He did not look up, and she walked away. Later, alone in her room, she wrote a letter she would never send. It began simply, "I do not know if you will ever see me, truly see me, but I have begun to forget the sound of my own laughter, and I think that means I am disappearing." When she finished, she folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside her bed. She thought she might burn it the next morning, but she never did. It was the first of many. Time passed at Ravenshade Manor in the same quiet rhythm as the ticking of its clocks. Morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, evenings sank into candlelight, and between them, life went on in measured restraint. To an outsider, nothing appeared amiss. The master of the house was a man of diligence and impeccable manners. His young wife was gracious, modest, and unfailingly polite. The servants admired their composure, and visitors praised their harmony. Yet behind closed doors, silence had become a constant companion. Eleanor rose each day before the household stirred. She would walk through the garden still heavy with dew, her hand grazing the tops of the hedges, her breath visible in the cool air. Sometimes she imagined that if she walked far enough, she might step out of the life she had been given and into another. But always, the stone walls of the estate stood like boundaries she could never cross. She tried to fill her hours with purpose. She read novels, played the pianoforte, oversaw the running of the house. She visited the tenants and sent food to the poor during the colder months. Her kindness was quiet but sincere, yet none of it filled the emptiness that lived between her and her husband. Henry's study door was often closed. Through it came the faint scratch of a pen, the turning of pages, the muted sound of someone pacing while thinking of distant things. He was a man devoted to order, and his life ran as smoothly as the trains he invested in. He spoke of profits, of land management, of the future of industry, but never of feelings. When he did address her, his words were correct, precise, never cruel yet never warm. She learned to measure her hopes in glances and gestures rather than in words. Once at dinner, he noticed her wince slightly as she lifted her glass. "Your hand," he said. "Are you hurt?" "Only a small cut from pruning roses," she replied. He nodded. "Be careful next time. They are sharper than they appear." That was all. The conversation drifted back into silence, but for the rest of the evening, Eleanor's mind replayed the moment endlessly, not because of what he had said, but because for one brief instant he had looked at her as if she were real. The garden became her refuge. It was there she felt closest to something like peace. The old gardener, Mr. Harlow, had served the Ravenshade family since Henry's childhood. His hands were rough, his back bent, but his eyes held a kindness that life had not managed to erase. "My lady," he said once, handing her a pair of gloves, "roses are stubborn things. You must cut them back cruelly if you want them to bloom again." She smiled faintly. "Then perhaps I have been too gentle." He glanced at her, understanding more than she wished him to. "Some things bloom slowly, my lady," he said. "Give them time." Eleanor thought of those words often. She wondered if love was like a rose bush, if it needed pruning, if it could survive neglect, if it would ever bloom again after so much cold. One afternoon, she heard the sound of hooves in the courtyard and looked from her window to see Henry return from town. The wind had disordered his hair, and the expression on his face was less guarded than usual. For a fleeting moment, she saw something almost human in his weariness. She hurried downstairs to greet him, heart lifted by the fragile hope that perhaps, this time, he might speak more gently. When she reached the entrance, he was already giving instructions to a servant. She waited until he turned toward her. "You have been away longer than expected," she said, her voice careful but sincere. "There were matters that required attention," he answered. "The markets are unstable this season." "I hope all is well," she said. "It will be," he replied, then paused as if searching for the proper formality. "I trust you have been comfortable." "Quite," she said softly. The silence stretched. He inclined his head politely, then walked past her toward his study. The faint scent of rain and tobacco lingered in the air long after he was gone. Eleanor stood still for a moment before returning to her room, her brief moment of hope dissolving into the same quiet ache that had followed her since the day she said her vows. That night, she could not sleep. She sat by the window, writing again. Her letters had become a diary of words never spoken. "Sometimes I think you live behind glass, and I am forever knocking, waiting for you to hear me. I do not wish to change you, only to be seen by you." Is that such a foolish hope? When she sealed the page, she felt no relief, only exhaustion. She placed the letter with the others, tucked neatly away in the drawer beside her bed. Days later, while overseeing the servants, she passed Henry in the corridor. He stopped and, to her surprise, asked, "Would you join me for supper this evening? There is a matter I wish to discuss." The invitation startled her. "Of course," she said quickly, her pulse quickening. When evening came, the dining room was softly lit. He stood by the fireplace, a letter in his hand. "I have been offered an opportunity in Manchester," he said. "A new investment in rail expansion. It will require travel. I may be gone for several weeks." "I see," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought it best to inform you personally," he added. "That was considerate of you." The conversation ended there. He seemed about to speak again, then thought better of it. When he finally left the room, she sat very still, staring into the fire until the flames blurred. She felt as if a door had closed that she had not even realized was open. In the days that followed, she helped him pack, arranged his documents, and ensured his journey would be comfortable. Each time she handed him something, a folded shirt, a sealed envelope, her fingers brushed his, but he did not seem to notice. The morning he left, the sky was heavy with clouds. She stood at the top of the stairs watching him mount his horse. He looked up briefly, inclined his head, and rode away without another word. Eleanor remained there until the sound of hooves faded into the distance. Then she whispered the words she had been afraid to say aloud. "Come back different, Henry, or do not come back at all." The morning after Henry's departure was pale and windless. Ravenshade Manor stood as it always had, serene and self-contained, yet to Eleanor the silence had taken on a different weight. It was no longer the stillness of composure, but the stillness that follows absence. She walked through the rooms as though in a dream, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. The scent of his tobacco lingered faintly in the air, a ghost of his presence, and though she had long thought herself used to solitude, the emptiness now felt unbearable. Days folded into one another, indistinguishable except for the passing of light through the tall windows. Eleanor tried to occupy her mind with the usual routines, but the rhythm of the house seemed broken without him. She had not expected to miss him. She told herself that what she felt was habit, not affection. Yet each morning she found herself glancing toward the road that wound through the valley, half hoping to see the distant shape of a rider returning earlier than expected. Letters came from him every few days. They were brief, written in his careful, even hand. He wrote of business negotiations, of delays and weather, of the efficiency of the railway engineers he met. Each letter was polite and impersonal, yet she read them as if they contained something hidden between the lines. When he ended with, "I hope you are well," she imagined, foolishly, that the words carried more than courtesy. She replied dutifully, her handwriting smaller each time, as though her voice was shrinking inside her. One evening, unable to bear the stillness, she sat in the library surrounded by the faint scent of old paper and leather. She took down one of the books he had often read, essays on commerce and law, subjects she barely understood, and opened it at random. Between the pages lay a pressed violet, so old it had faded to grey. For reasons she could not name, tears filled her eyes. She closed the book carefully and whispered into the empty room, "Why do you keep fragments of beauty if you never look at them?" The days grew shorter. The wind brought with it the smell of wood smoke and frost. When the first snow began to fall, She stood by the window watching it cover the garden, softening every sharp edge. It was beautiful, and yet the sight filled her with a sense of dread she could not explain. In January, one of the servants brought her a new letter from the city. The handwriting was not Henry's. It was his assistant, informing her that the Viscount's business in Manchester was progressing well, but that he had decided to extend his stay due to a promising negotiation. The words were practical, devoid of sentiment, but they struck her like a door closing once more. She folded the letter neatly, placed it on her writing desk, and sat staring at it until dusk. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit that she was tired not only of loneliness, but of pretending it did not hurt. That night, she returned to her drawer of unsent letters. There were now more than 30, each written on the same cream paper, tied together with a faded ribbon. She untied them and read a few at random. The earliest ones were hopeful, almost cheerful, full of gentle patience. The later ones carried the weariness of a woman who had learned that silence answers nothing. You once told me that love is a distraction from reason. Perhaps you were right, but reason has never warmed a heart, nor eased a night such as this. She placed the bundle on her lap, uncertain whether to burn them or send them all at once. Before she could decide, footsteps approached her door. It was Mrs. Linton, the housekeeper, her face pale and anxious. "My lady," she said, "there has been news from Manchester. A letter arrived by courier. The Viscount left the city several days ago to return home. There has been an accident on the southern road." Eleanor's breath caught. "An accident?" "They say his horse was startled near the bridge. The animal returned alone." For a long moment, she could not move. The sound of the fire seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. "Is he alive?" she asked finally. "They do not know," Mrs. Linton replied. "A search party has been sent." Eleanor rose without realizing it, the letters falling to the floor. "Send word as soon as anything is learned. I will wait here." That night she did not sleep. She sat by the window, watching the storm intensify. The snow thickened until the world beyond disappeared. The candle beside her burned low, its flame trembling in the cold draughts that slipped through the old windows. Every gust of wind made the panes shiver. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and prayed not with words, but with a kind of silent desperation that needed no language. She thought of the last morning she had seen him, standing in the courtyard beneath a pale sky. She remembered the way he had adjusted his gloves, the way he had nodded curtly before riding away. She had wanted to call out, to ask him to stay, but pride had kept her still. Now that memory replayed endlessly, and with each repetition it grew heavier, like a weight pressing against her chest. Near dawn, the sound of hooves broke through the storm. She rushed to the window, but the rider who arrived was not Henry. It was one of the men from the village, his coat soaked through, his expression grim. They had found him. Alive but unconscious, brought to a nearby inn for shelter. He had struck his head on a rock when he fell. The physician could not promise whether he would wake. Within the hour, Eleanor was ready to leave. The servants tried to dissuade her. The roads were treacherous, the snow deep, but she would not listen. Wrapped in her cloak, she stepped into the waiting carriage, her breath forming clouds in the air. The journey was long and cold. The horses struggled through the drifts, and the wheels creaked under the weight of ice. As they neared the village, the first light of morning touched the horizon, pale and uncertain. She pressed her hands together, whispering his name under her breath, as though saying it might summon him back from the edge. When at last the carriage stopped outside the inn, she stepped into the snow without waiting for help. Her boots sank deep, her dress heavy with frost. The innkeeper met her at the door and led her upstairs. He lay on the bed, motionless, his face colorless against the white pillow. For a moment she thought he might already be gone. Then she saw the faint rise and fall of his chest. She sank to her knees beside him and took his hand in both of hers. It was cold, roughened from the rains. "Henry," she whispered, "please wake. Do not leave me like this, not without knowing." He did not stir. The candle beside the bed flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the sound of something ending and something else, faint and uncertain, beginning. When Henry Ravenshade opened his eyes again, the world was pale and formless. The air smelled of medicine and damp cloth, and the low crackle of a fire whispered from somewhere nearby. For several moments he could not remember where he was or how he had come there. A dull ache pulsed behind his temples, spreading outward in waves. When he tried to speak, his voice came as a whisper, dry and uncertain. A woman leaned forward from the shadows. Her face hovered above him, unfamiliar yet strangely familiar, as if seen once in another lifetime. Her hand reached toward him and then stopped, trembling in hesitation. "Henry," she said softly, "you are safe. You are home." He looked at her without answering. Her voice carried warmth, but he could find no memory to match it. She waited for him to respond, hope flickering in her eyes, but none came. Finally, she asked if he knew who she was. He studied her carefully. Her features were delicate, her expression composed. Yet beneath her calm he sensed exhaustion. Her gaze was too steady to belong to a stranger, and yet he could not place her. "No," he said at last. "I do not know you." The words left his lips without emotion, but their effect on her was immediate. Her shoulders stiffened, and for a moment her face seemed to fold inward, as though something fragile inside her had broken. Then she nodded and said nothing more. Later, when the physician arrived, he examined Henry with clinical detachment. He asked simple questions: his name, his title, the date, and received correct answers to all except one. Henry could recall his childhood, his education, his business affairs, but nothing of his recent life. The physician concluded that the blow to his head had erased fragments of memory. It might return, or it might not. Eleanor listened quietly to the explanation. When the physician left, she remained seated beside the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Henry watched her from the corner of his eye. She did not speak again, and he could not decide whether her silence was kindness or sorrow. Over the next days he learned fragments of his condition through observation. The people who came to his room addressed him with deference. They called him my lord, spoke of estate matters, and looked toward the woman beside him for instruction. She was evidently the mistress of the house, and the servants treated her with quiet affection. Yet whenever he turned to her, she seemed to shrink slightly, as though unsure whether she still had the right to stand so near. One evening, as twilight fell, she brought him a tray of tea. The scent of honey drifted from the cup. When he thanked her, she smiled faintly and sat opposite him. "You need not trouble yourself," he said. "There are servants for that." "I wish to," she replied. Her voice was gentle but carried a tremor he could not ignore. He studied her face again, tracing the subtle lines of fatigue around her eyes. "Forgive me," he said slowly, "but you have not told me who you are to me." For a heartbeat she was utterly still. Then, with quiet dignity, she said, "I am your wife." Quote. The words fell into the space between them, like stones sinking into deep water. "My wife," he repeated, testing the phrase as though it belonged to someone else. "Yes." He looked down at his hands, at the gold band that encircled his finger. It had always been there, unnoticed, yet now it gleamed with new meaning. "How long have we been married?" "Nearly 3 years," she said. He nodded, though the number felt unreal. "And before the accident, what kind of man was I?" Her eyes flickered with something like fear. "You were responsible, diligent, often away on business." "That sounds like a description from a ledger," he said. "Was I kind?" She hesitated. The silence stretched until it became its own answer. "I see," he murmured. That night, he could not sleep. The bed felt too large, the house too still. He rose and walked to the window, looking out over the garden where snow lay unbroken in the moonlight. Somewhere beneath that white silence, he sensed the outline of a life he could no longer reach. Behind him, he heard a faint rustle and turned to find Eleanor standing at the doorway, wrapped in a shawl. "Forgive me," she said softly. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You did not." "I could not sleep either," she admitted. "I thought perhaps the quiet would help." "Clote." He hesitated, then gestured toward the window. "It is strange," he said. "I know this view, yet it feels as if I am seeing it for the first time." She stepped closer, her voice almost a whisper. "Perhaps it is a chance to begin again." The simplicity of her words unsettled him. He turned his gaze back to the snow, uncertain what beginning she imagined. When she left the room, the faint scent of her perfume lingered, a delicate trace of something he did not understand. Over the following weeks he grew stronger. The bruises faded, the headaches lessened, and he began walking through the halls of Ravenshade Manor. The house seemed to recognize him even when he did not recognize it. Servants bowed, doors opened, familiar patterns guided his steps. Yet at the center of everything was the one person who remained a mystery. Eleanor moved through the house like a shadow made of patience. She oversaw meals, spoke to the staff, and accompanied him on short walks in the garden. When he thanked her, she always smiled and said there was nothing to forgive. But beneath her composure, he sensed tension like glass holding back water. One afternoon, as they walked along the frozen path between the rose bushes, he stopped suddenly. "You said we have been married for 3 years," he said. "Were we happy?" She looked at the barren thorns and seemed to weigh her words carefully. "We were peaceful." "Peaceful," he repeated. "That sounds like another kind of silence." Her hands tightened around the folds of her cloak. Perhaps silence was the only thing we both understood. The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of earth beneath the snow. He wanted to ask more, but the look on her face stopped him. It was not merely sadness, it was endurance, the expression of someone who had learned to live with the ache of remembering alone. When they returned to the house, she excused herself and disappeared into the east corridor. Henry remained by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to piece together the fragments of a life he could no longer claim. He had once been a man who built railways, who turned landscapes into lines on a map, who ordered the world through logic and precision. Yet now he found himself standing at the edge of something he could not measure, a woman's silence and the shape of his own forgotten heart. Winter loosened its hold upon Ravenshade Manor slowly, as though reluctant to release the silence it had woven around the house. The snow melted in thin rivulets that ran down the garden paths, revealing dark soil beneath. Each morning, Henry walked farther than the day before, leaning on a cane, though his strength had mostly returned. The physicians declared his recovery remarkable, yet he felt no sense of triumph. He was well in body but haunted in spirit, a man restored to health but not to himself. Eleanor accompanied him on these walks, her steps measured to match his. At first their conversations were practical: the weather, the repairs the servants were making, the books she had been reading aloud to him in the evenings. But gradually something softer began to fill the space between their words. It was not yet affection, not yet trust, but it was a gentleness that neither had known in the years before the fall. Henry could not remember what kind of husband he had been, but he suspected he had not deserved her patience. She moved through the days with quiet grace, her voice low and steady, her hands never idle. There was dignity in the way she tended to his comfort without subservience, a strength that made him uneasy because it suggested she had endured more than she wished him to see. Sometimes, when she thought he was not looking, he caught a fleeting sadness in her expression, a gaze turned inward, as if she were remembering something too heavy to carry in the open. It stirred something in him, an ache unconnected to memory yet unmistakably his own. One afternoon, as they walked by the lake behind the manor, a gust of wind caught her shawl and carried it across the water. Without thinking, Henry reached out to catch it. The movement sent a jolt of pain through his arm, but he laughed quietly when the fabric fluttered against his hand. Eleanor looked at him with surprise, then smiled a true smile, bright and unguarded. The sight struck him like sunlight breaking through clouds. In that moment he realized he had never seen her smile before, or perhaps he had and forgotten. He wanted to ask her to do it again, to see how her eyes softened when she did. Instead, he handed back the shawl and said only, "It would have been a pity to lose this." "Thank you," she replied. Her voice trembled slightly, as though laughter and tears had met within it. That night, while she read to him by the fire, he found himself watching her more than listening. The book lay open in her lap, her fingers tracing the lines as she spoke. Her hair had come loose, falling across her shoulder. Each word she read seemed to move through the room like the slow turning of a page in time. When she finished, he said, "You read beautifully." "I have had practice," she said, closing the book. "It fills the evenings." "Did I never listen before?" he asked. She hesitated, the faintest pause before answering. "No," she said softly. "You preferred numbers to stories." He nodded slowly, unsure what to say. The fire crackled, sending small sparks upward. After a while he asked, "And you? Did you prefer silence to words?" "I preferred words," she said, "but silence does not argue back." He looked at her across the dimly lit room and thought that perhaps memory was not the only kind of loss that could wound a person. There were other forms of forgetting, the kind done deliberately, day after day, until one learned not to expect warmth. When she rose to leave, he said her name. She turned, waiting. "If I had not fallen," he asked quietly, "would we be speaking like this now?" She did not answer at once. Then she said, "Perhaps not. You were not cruel, Henry, only distant. The fall changed more than your memory." Comes other. After she left, he remained by the fire long into the night, staring at the empty chair she had occupied. The house, once filled with silence, now seemed to breathe with the echo of her voice. He wondered what kind of man he had been to her, what he had done to make her eyes so cautious, her gentleness so careful. The following morning, he asked Mrs. Linton about the years before his accident. The housekeeper hesitated, torn between loyalty and honesty. "His lordship was always fair," she said finally, "but the mistress bore loneliness bravely. There were many nights when she dined alone. She never complained. Henry thanked her, though the words filled him with shame. That evening, when Eleanor entered the dining room, he stood until she took her seat, a gesture he suspected he had long forgotten. She noticed but said nothing. During the meal, he asked about her work in the village, the families she helped, the small school she had established for the children of the tenants. As she spoke, her voice grew livelier, and he realized how rare it was to see her animated by something she loved. "You have done much good here," he said. Her eyes dropped to her hands. "It gave me purpose," she murmured. The house was too large for only silence. Quote. He reached across the table, and before he could think better of it, covered her hand with his. Her fingers went still beneath his touch. For a moment neither spoke. The sound of the clock filled the room, each tick marking the fragile balance between past and present. Then she withdrew her hand gently. "I am glad you are recovering," she said quietly. "You should rest." After she left, he realized his hand still felt the warmth of hers. He stared at his palm as though it might hold an answer. That night he dreamed. He was standing in the same garden, but the roses were in bloom, and someone was calling his name from beyond the hedges. When he turned, the sunlight caught her hair, and he felt the rush of certainty that he had been here before, that this moment had once been real. He woke with the sound of her laughter still in his ears, faint as music fading into morning. For the first time since the fall, he felt something other than confusion. It was not memory, not yet. It was longing, pure, wordless, and impossibly familiar. He did not tell her about the dream. Some things, he thought, were too delicate to speak aloud. But as spring approached and the first buds appeared in the garden, Henry Ravenshade began to understand that forgetting had not erased everything. Beneath the silence, something within him was beginning to bloom again. Spring arrived softly at Ravenshade Manor. The snow retreated from the fields, leaving behind a sheen of moisture that turned the earth dark and rich. The first green shoots pushed through the thawing soil, fragile yet certain of their purpose. Each morning the air carried a faint sweetness, a promise of warmth. The house, which had endured so many months of silence, seemed to breathe again. Henry felt the change before he noticed it. The heaviness that had filled him since the accident began to ease, replaced by a restlessness he could not name. The mornings called him outside, and he walked longer distances with Eleanor by his side. Her steps were light, her voice calm, and though they spoke little, the quiet between them had become something almost tender. He no longer asked her about the past. The answers, when given, had left him uneasy, filled with guilt for memories he did not possess but somehow felt he should. Instead, he asked her about the present, the tenants she visited, the books she read, the colors she preferred in the garden. Each question felt like a small act of rebuilding, a bridge to a world he wished he had never broken. One morning, as they passed the rose beds newly pruned by the gardener, Eleanor knelt to brush soil from a stem. The movement stirred a faint recognition in him. The way she bent her head, the curve of her hand upon the branch, it was as if he had seen it before, perhaps on a day long vanished. A shiver ran through him, brief and inexplicable. "You have planted these yourself," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied. "They were my comfort when words could not help." Her tone was calm, but he heard the shadow behind it. "They will bloom again soon," he said. "They always do," she murmured, and stood. They continued walking, the sunlight falling through the bare branches. When they reached the lake, the water mirrored the pale blue of the sky. He found himself watching her reflection upon its surface, the shape of her face, the loose strand of hair the wind refused to tame. "Eleanor," he said after a while. She turned to him, waiting. "Do you believe that people can begin again?" Her expression softened. "I believe that sometimes forgetting is a kind of mercy, Crowday. But if forgetting means losing what we once were," he said, "is it still mercy?" "Perhaps," she replied. "It depends on what was lost." Her words lingered in his mind long after they returned to the house. That evening he sat alone in his study, staring at the papers spread before him. The handwriting on them was his own, precise and confident, yet the man who had written them seemed like a stranger. Contracts, investments, schedules, proof of a life lived with purpose, but without warmth. He closed the ledger and sat back, his gaze falling upon a small sketch on the corner of his desk. It was a rough drawing of the garden, the rose beds marked with neat lines. Beside them, in faint pencil, someone had written a name, Eleanor's Walk. He traced the letters with his finger, wondering when he had written them. The memory refused to come, but something inside him stirred an echo of a feeling that had once been ignored too long. The next day brought sunlight strong enough to reach the far corners of the garden. Henry found Eleanor there, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up. She was planting new bulbs, her hair damp with sweat, her hands stained with soil. For the first time, he saw her not as a figure of quiet composure, but as a living woman, full of quiet strength. The sight moved him deeply. "Allow me," he said, crouching beside her. She looked at him, startled, then smiled faintly. "You will ruin your gloves. They can be cleaned." He reached into the soil beside her, awkward at first, then steadier. They worked in silence, the rhythm of their movements falling into unspoken harmony. A lock of hair slipped from her braid, brushing her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out to tuck it back. His fingers brushed her skin, warm and soft, and for an instant, the world seemed to still. Eleanor froze. He withdrew his hand at once, murmuring an apology, but she shook her head slightly, eyes downcast. "It is all right." The air between them shifted, heavy with words neither dared to speak. Later, when she returned to the house, Henry remained in the garden. He stood among the rows of roses, staring at the pale buds that had not yet opened. A memory flickered so faint he might have imagined it. A woman standing here, sunlight on her hair, turning to him with a smile both shy and brave. A voice saying, "Do you ever think that beauty can grow from pain?" The image vanished before he could hold it, leaving him breathless. He pressed a hand to his temple, not from pain but from the sheer strangeness of the moment. That night he told Eleanor of it. She listened quietly, her face unreadable. When he finished, she said, "Perhaps you are remembering." "I do not know," he admitted. "It felt more like dreaming. Dreams are sometimes doors," she said softly. "If they open, do not be afraid to walk through." He looked at her across the firelight. "Were we ever happy, Eleanor?" Her gaze dropped to the flames. "Not as we are now," she said. "That may be enough." In the days that followed, Henry began to notice small things he had never seen before, the way her voice deepened slightly when she read poetry aloud, the faint dimple that appeared when she laughed, the tiny scar near her wrist, where a thorn had once caught her. These details gathered around him like constellations, guiding him through the darkness of his forgetting. One evening, as they stood on the terrace watching the sunset, he said, "I do not know who I was, but I know who I am now, and whoever that man was before, I do not wish to become him again if it means losing this." Eleanor's breath caught. She turned toward him slowly, the fading light painting her face in gold. "This?" she repeated softly. He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Peace," he said. "And you?" For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, barely above a whisper, she replied, "Peace can be fragile, Henry. Do not promise what you cannot remember." The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving only the glow of twilight between them. Neither spoke again. Yet in that silence, something unspoken passed a promise that did not need words. And as night fell over Ravenshade, Henry found himself standing at the threshold of something that felt both new and impossibly old, as if love itself had been waiting all this time for him to remember its name. The days lengthened, and Ravenshade Manor filled with the scent of new blossoms. The roses that Eleanor had planted began to bloom, each petal unfolding as if reluctant to disturb the peace that had settled over the house. The servants spoke in hushed tones, aware that something delicate was forming between their master and mistress, something softer than the silence that had ruled before. Henry felt the change as both comfort and unease. The comfort came from the calm presence of Eleanor, the ease with which her quiet steadiness filled the spaces between his thoughts. The unease came from what he did not know, from the blank years that stretched behind him like a sealed room he was afraid to open. He began to spend long hours in his study, hoping that work might bring clarity. The desk, the shelves, the arrangement of papers all bore the imprint of his former self. It was a place that should have belonged to him, yet each object seemed to hold a secret he had not earned. One afternoon, while sorting through the drawers, he found a stack of ledgers carefully labeled and tied with string. Beneath them lay a small wooden box, plain but finely crafted. He might have ignored it, but something about its weight drew his attention. He lifted the lid. Inside were folded sheets of paper bound together with a faded ribbon. The first page bore no signature, only his name written in a hand both graceful and firm. He hesitated before unfolding it. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear. "Henry, I write because silence has become heavier than speech. You speak of trains and trade, of progress and precision, but never of people. I live beside you, yet I do not think you see me. Sometimes I wonder if love requires two hearts, or whether one is enough to carry the weight of it alone." He stopped reading. A strange dizziness overtook him, as if the walls had shifted. The handwriting, the phrasing, it was Eleanor's. He turned the pages and found more letters, each dated in careful order. Some were long, others only a few lines, but all carried the same quiet ache. You once told me that feelings are distractions. I tried to believe you, but there are nights when the silence in this house feels like a tide that will drown me, and I find myself wishing you would say my name, even if only in anger. I have begun to plant roses because they are the only things that respond when touched. They bleed when I am careless, but at least they feel alive. He read until the words blurred. The letters spanned nearly 2 years of their marriage, a record of her endurance, her loneliness, her attempts to reach him. Each line was a mirror held to his own indifference, showing him the man he had been before the fall. He pressed his fingers against his temples, trying to recall some fragment that might make sense of it, but his mind remained blank. The only image that came was of her face the day he had woken tired, pale, watching him as though she had already lost him once before. He folded the letters carefully and placed them back in the box. For a long time he sat in the quiet room, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantel. The man these letters described was not the man he wished to be. Yet the pain within them was undeniably his fault, written in the same calm script that had served him so well in business and so poorly in life. When Eleanor entered later that evening, he looked up sharply. She paused on the threshold, sensing something in his expression. "Henry," she said, "you look unwell." Quote, he opened his mouth to speak, but the words refused to come. Finally he asked, "Why did you never send them?" Her eyes widened. For a heartbeat she seemed unable to breathe. Then she stepped forward slowly, her composure returning like a mask carefully lifted into place. "You found them," she said. "I did not mean to pry." She shook her head. "They were never meant to be hidden forever. Perhaps some part of me hoped you would find them one day." Close. "Then why keep them?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why hold so much pain in silence?" "Because silence was all that would not wound you," she said softly. "I wrote to survive the kind of love that could not be spoken." He rose from his chair, the papers still trembling in his hand. "I do not remember the man who caused this, but I feel his shadow every time you look at me. I cannot bear it, Eleanor. Tell me, was I so cold?" She met his gaze steadily. "You were not cruel. You were distant. You thought kindness was weakness and affection a burden. I learned to live beside that distance, until it became the shape of my world." He closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing against him like the memory he did not possess. "I wish I could undo it," he said. "I believe you," she replied. "But wishing changes nothing. What matters is who you are now." He turned toward the window, the fading sunlight catching the edges of his reflection. "And who am I now?" he asked quietly. "The man who read those letters and felt sorrow," she said. "The man who finally saw me." The simplicity of her answer struck him harder than any accusation could. He reached out, but she stepped back gently. "Do not pity me," she said. "If I wanted pity, I would have sent them." "I do not pity you," he said. "I envy your courage." A silence followed, softer than the ones they had known before. It was not the silence of avoidance but of understanding too deep for words. When she left the study, he remained where he was, the box of letters resting on the desk beside him. The roses outside swayed in the evening wind, their petals bruised by the day's rain. He thought of her tending them year after year, hands cut by thorns, refusing to stop. That night he could not sleep. He lay awake, listening to the rustle of the curtains, the distant hoot of an owl, the slow rhythm of his own heart. He imagined her in the next room, perhaps awake as well, perhaps remembering the years he could not. He wished he could cross the distance between them, not with apologies but with something truer, something like love. As dawn approached, he rose and walked to the window. The garden was veiled in mist, the roses barely visible through it, yet even hidden, they were alive, waiting for the light. He understood then that love, too, could live unseen for years, growing quietly in the dark, waiting for the courage of one small act to bring it into bloom. The morning came wrapped in mist. Light drifted through the windows of Ravenshade Manor, pale and uncertain, as if even the day hesitated to begin. Henry had not slept. The box of letters lay open on the desk before him, its contents scattered like fallen leaves. He had read them again through the night, each line cutting deeper than the one before. The words had become a voice in his mind, Eleanor's voice, soft, patient, and unbearably sad. He rose and crossed to the window. The garden stretched before him, silvered with dew. The roses bowed under their own weight. A faint breeze stirred them, carrying their scent into the room. The air felt thick with memory. He closed his eyes, and in that darkness, images began to stir, fragmented, disjointed, yet painfully vivid. A dinner table lit by candles, the sound of her laughter, fragile and uncertain, his own voice, cool and distant, cutting across it, the flicker of hurt in her eyes before she turned away, then another image, a corridor at dusk, her figure standing by the window, light tracing the edge of her profile. He had passed her without a word, the echo of his footsteps swallowing the silence she left behind. He opened his eyes, breath quickening. The memories were not full scenes, only shards of feeling the taste of regret, the sharp edge of pride. Yet they were enough to make him understand what the letters had only hinted. He had not merely neglected her, he had built walls so high that even his own heart could not climb them. He pressed his palms to the window pane, the cold seeping into his skin. Outside, Eleanor moved among the rose bushes, pruning away the dead blooms. Her movements were steady, deliberate, as if each cut were a quiet act of endurance. Watching her, he felt the weight of every unspoken apology. Later that day, he walked through the house in a daze. The servants greeted him with respect, unaware of the storm inside him. Every room held echoes of his former life, a book left half-read, a painting chosen without sentiment, a clock whose precision mirrored his own obsession with control. He saw now that he had built a world so perfectly ordered that there had been no space for warmth. When he entered the music room, dust motes swirled in the afternoon light. The pianoforte stood untouched, its keys faintly yellowed. He remembered, suddenly, the faint sound of music, her hands on the keys, hesitant at first, then sure. The memory struck him with such force that his knees weakened. He gripped the edge of the instrument and closed his eyes. He saw himself standing here, years earlier, speaking without thought. "Enough, Eleanor. I cannot work with that noise." The sound of her reply came faint and trembling. "It was only a song, Henry." He had turned away then. Indifferent, he could hear it now, the soft click of the door closing behind her. When he opened his eyes, the present swam back into focus, but the guilt remained. He touched one of the keys lightly. A single note rang out, pure and mournful. The sound hung in the air, then faded, leaving him alone with his shame. That evening he sought her in the garden. The light was fading, the horizon painted in shades of gold and grey. She was kneeling among the roses, her hands gloved, her expression serene. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up, startled by the intensity in his voice. "Is something wrong?" "Everything," he said softly. He knelt beside her, heedless of the damp earth. "I remember." Her hands stilled. For a long moment she said nothing, the air between them filled with the scent of roses and rain. "What do you remember?" she asked finally. "Enough," he said. "Enough to know that I failed you. I remember the nights you dined alone, the mornings I left without a word. I remember how I spoke to you as though you were an obligation rather than a gift." Eleanor's face was calm, but her eyes betrayed the tremor of emotion beneath. "Henry," she said quietly, "the past cannot be undone." "I know," he replied, "but it can be faced, and I cannot bear that you carried all of it alone." She turned away, looking toward the fading light. "You could not help who you were then." "Perhaps not," he said, "but I can choose who I am now." He reached for her hand. For a moment she did not move, then allowed his fingers to close around hers. The warmth of her touch steadied him, but it also brought tears to his eyes, tears he had not shed since childhood. "I read your letters," he said, "every word of them. I wish I had known then how to listen." "I wrote them for myself," she said, "not for you to read." "And yet they saved me," he said. "They showed me the man I never want to be again." The first stars began to appear overhead. The world around them grew still, as if waiting for something to be said. "I will not ask you to forgive me," he continued. "Forgiveness should not be earned with words. But if you can bear it, I would like to begin again, not from the moment I fell, but from this one." Eleanor looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You think memory is a burden," she said. "But memory is also what binds us to meaning. If you begin again, Henry, you must carry all of it, both the cruelty and the kindness." "Woad?" "I will," he said. "Every part of it." Her gaze softened then, and for the first time she smiled, not with hope, but with recognition. "Then perhaps there is something worth saving after all." They stood together in the fading light, the scent of roses surrounding them like a benediction. Henry felt the past pressing against him not as a weight, but as a shadow that made the present more precious. That night, as he lay awake beside the quiet of the house, he thought of how easily love can die in the absence of tenderness, and how astonishing it was that hers had survived even his forgetting. He understood now that what he felt for her was not born of guilt or pity. It was love, steady, painful and real, the kind that grows only through sorrow. When dawn came, he rose and wrote in his journal, "I have remembered her, and in remembering her I have found myself." The day began with rain. It was not a violent storm but a steady, patient drizzle that blurred the edges of the garden and softened the air with the scent of earth and roses. Eleanor stood at the window watching the droplets gather on the glass. Beyond the pane, the world appeared distant, almost dreamlike. The grey light touched everything with gentleness, and for the first time in many years, she felt no urge to resist it. Henry had been gone since morning. He had ridden into the village to settle accounts with the tenants and oversee repairs on the estate. Before leaving, he had spoken little, though his eyes had carried the weight of unspoken thoughts. Since the night he confessed his memories had returned, the space between them had grown delicate, filled with emotions neither could yet name. When the clock struck 4, the rain lightened, and she heard the sound of hooves in the courtyard. She went downstairs just as the door opened. Henry entered, his coat damp, his hair darkened by the rain. He removed his gloves slowly and looked at her with an expression that seemed both weary and resolute. "I hoped you would be here," he said. "I was watching the rain," she replied. He hesitated, then said quietly, "May I speak with you in the garden?" She nodded. They walked through the long corridor where portraits of his ancestors hung, their painted eyes following them like witnesses. When they stepped outside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of roses after rain. The paths were slick with mud, and droplets clung to the petals like tiny mirrors. They stopped near the old stone bench beneath the archway. Henry turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I remember everything now," he said. "Not only what I did, but what I failed to do." Eleanor folded her hands together. "You do not need to explain." "Yes," he said. "I do. For years I thought emotion was weakness. I buried myself in work and numbers because they were safe, because they did not ask anything of me that I did not choose to give. When I married you, I told myself it was duty. And when you tried to reach me, I mistook your kindness for intrusion. I thought love could be avoided if I simply ignored it." He paused, his breath visible in the cool air. "The fall took my memory, but it gave me what I had always lacked, the chance to see you without the armor of pride. I looked at you as if for the first time and found the only part of my life that mattered." Eleanor looked away, her gaze fixed on the wet path. "It is easy to love once the pain is forgotten." "I have not forgotten," he said. "I remember your silence, your patience, your eyes the night I left for Manchester. I remember how I made you small in your own home. Every memory cuts, Eleanor, but I welcome them because they remind me of what I owe you." Quote. Her lips trembled, though her voice remained steady. "You owe me nothing. What is gone cannot be rewritten." He took a step closer. "Perhaps not rewritten, but perhaps it can be redeemed." She shook her head. "Redemption is for saints and stories. We are only people." He reached out, not touching her yet, his hand hovering between them like a question. "Then let me be human for once. Let me tell you that I love you, not as an apology, but as a truth I finally understand. I do not expect your forgiveness, only the chance to deserve it." The rain had begun again, light and persistent, falling on their faces like cold tears. Eleanor stood still, her breath shallow. "Do you know," she said softly, "how many times I imagined hearing those words? I dreamed of them until the dream turned bitter. And when you fell, when you forgot me, I thought perhaps fate had been merciful that I would be spared from hoping again." He lowered his hand, his voice barely audible. "And now?" "Now," she said, "I do not know what to feel. I should hate you for the years you took from me, but I cannot. I should fear this new tenderness, but I do not. What I feel is tiredness, the kind that comes after surviving too long." He looked at her with quiet anguish. "Then let me carry the weight for a while." She met his eyes, and for a moment time seemed to hold its breath. Then she said, "Love is not a burden to be carried. It is a choice, Henry, and choices must be made freely. I am making mine," he said. "Every day I wake and choose you." Her tears came suddenly, not from pain but from release. She covered her mouth as if to stop them, but he took her hands gently and lowered them. "Eleanor," he whispered, "please let me begin again, not from obligation, not from memory, but from this moment." For a long while she said nothing. The sound of rain filled the air, mingled with the faint chirping of birds returning after the storm. Finally, she drew a slow breath. "Then begin," she said. "But understand that I cannot forget what came before. I can only forgive it by living differently." "I will," he said simply. She looked at him, searching for doubt, and found none. "If you falter," she asked. Then I will stand again, he replied, because now I know what I stand for. Eleanor's expression softened. She reached up and touched his face lightly, tracing the scar near his temple, the mark the fall had left behind. Perhaps the fall was not punishment, she said. Perhaps it was grace disguised as pain. He caught her hand and pressed it to his lips. Then I will spend whatever time is left proving it was not in vain. They stood beneath the archway as the rain eased, the grey clouds parting to reveal a pale stripe of sunlight across the garden. The roses, heavy with water, bent toward the light as though drawn by faith alone. For the first time in years, Eleanor smiled, a small, trembling smile that felt like the beginning of something fragile and real. Henry looked at her and saw not the woman he had forgotten, but the woman he had finally remembered, the heart he had lost and found again. As they walked back toward the house, the last drops of rain fell behind them, and the path glistened like silver. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, alive, and waiting to be filled with new words, new beginnings. The days that followed were unlike any that had come before. The air inside Ravenshade Manor seemed lighter, the silence no longer heavy but full of quiet understanding. The servants noticed it first, the soft murmur of two voices at breakfast, the faint sound of laughter echoing down the hall. They spoke of it discreetly, as though afraid that acknowledging the change too loudly might cause it to vanish. Henry and Eleanor did not speak much of the past. Words were no longer needed for what had already been forgiven. Instead, they built their peace through small gestures. He began joining her on her morning walks, sometimes carrying her basket when she visited the tenants. She took her meals with him again, not from obligation but because the distance between them had ceased to exist. Each act was simple, yet together they formed the pattern of something whole, something alive. One morning, as they stood on the terrace, Henry said quietly, "Do you ever think about the day we married?" Eleanor looked out at the garden where the roses were once again in bloom. "I try not to," she admitted. "It feels like another lifetime." "It was," he said, "and I would change it if I could." She turned to him. "But we cannot relive the past." "No," he replied, "but we can honor it. We began our life together in duty and silence. Perhaps we might choose to begin again in truth this time." He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band, unadorned and warm from his touch. "I would like to renew our vows," he said. "Not in a church, not before witnesses, but here, where our lives truly began to mend." Eleanor stared at the ring, her breath caught between surprise and tenderness. "Henry," she said softly, "you need not do this." "I know," he replied. "That is why it matters." For a moment she said nothing. Then she smiled faintly. "When?" "Tomorrow," he said. "At sunset." The following day passed quietly. The house was still, as though holding its breath. Eleanor spent the morning arranging flowers, white roses and sprigs of lavender, placing them in vases along the terrace. She wore a simple gown of pale blue, the same color she had worn on the day they first met, though she no longer remembered choosing it for that reason. Henry watched her from the doorway, struck by the serenity of her movements, the way the light touched her hair. As the sun descended, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, they stood together in the garden. The air was warm, fragrant with the scent of summer. A few servants lingered discreetly at a distance, pretending to busy themselves but unwilling to miss the quiet beauty of the moment. Henry took Eleanor's hands in his. "3 years ago," he said, "I promised to honor you, though I did not understand what that meant. I kept my word only in form, not in spirit. Today I make a new promise to see you, to hear you, and to walk beside you not out of duty but out of devotion. You are no longer my obligation, Eleanor. You are my choice." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, though she smiled through them. "And I," she said, "once promised to obey, though I did not yet know how to keep my heart safe. I lived in silence because I believed words would not change you. I was wrong. Words can change everything if spoken with truth. So I promised to speak when silence would wound, to forgive when pride would separate us, and to trust that love can begin even after everything else has ended." Henry slipped the new ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting all this time. He leaned forward and kissed her, not the restrained gesture of a man fulfilling ceremony, but the quiet, reverent kiss of someone finally at peace. When they parted, the first evening star had appeared above them. The servants watching from afar felt something in their throats tighten, though they could not have said why. The couple they served had always been admirable, but now, for the first time, they were human, flawed, forgiven, and radiant in their simplicity. Later, as the last light faded, Eleanor and Henry sat together on the bench beneath the archway. The garden hummed softly with the sounds of night crickets in the grass, the faint rustle of petals closing. Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, and he covered her hand with his. "Do you ever think," he asked quietly, "that we were meant to fall before we could stand?" "Perhaps," she said. "Some things must break before they can become whole." Quote. He turned his head slightly, his breath stirring her hair. "You have changed me more than time or loss ever could. And you," she said, "have shown me that love can be a kind of courage." They sat in silence for a long while, the warmth of their bodies warding off the cool of the evening. When at last they rose to return to the house, Henry paused to look back at the garden. The roses shimmered faintly in the starlight, their fragrance filling the air. "I used to think beauty was something that could be owned," he said. "Now I know it is something to be tended." Eleanor smiled. "Then we shall tend it together." Inside the house, the candles had been lit, their glow spilling gently across the floor. The shadows no longer seemed so deep, nor the rooms so large. The walls that had once held only silence now carried the faint echo of shared laughter. That night, as they prepared to sleep, Henry took her hand once more. "If I forget again," he whispered, "remind me of this." "I will," she said, "and if I forget to believe, remind me too." He drew her close, the rhythm of her heartbeat steady against his chest. The years behind them no longer felt like chains, but like roots anchoring them to the present. The storm that had once nearly destroyed them had, in its strange way, given them both a new beginning. As the candles burned low, Eleanor thought of the words they had spoken in the garden and smiled in the darkness. Love, she realized, was not found in grand declarations or perfect memories, but in the quiet choice to begin again each day, without fear. Summer ripened slowly at Ravenshade Manor. The air grew warm and fragrant, filled with the hum of bees and the rustle of leaves. The days stretched long and golden, and the nights drifted in with a hush of crickets and starlight. The great house, once cold and formal, now breathed with quiet contentment. Laughter passed through its halls like a melody rediscovered after years of silence. Eleanor spent her mornings in the garden, tending to the roses that had become a part of her life's rhythm. Henry often joined her, bringing his papers and ledgers but rarely opening them. He preferred to sit nearby, watching as she moved among the flowers. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. The comfort between them no longer required words. The years before the fall had left their scars, but they had also taught them how to be gentle with each other and with themselves. Henry had learned to slow the measured pace of his thoughts, to let stillness be more than emptiness. Eleanor had learned to trust her own strength, to see that forgiveness was not surrender but freedom. Together, they had built a peace born not of perfection but of persistence. One morning, as the light slanted through the tall windows of his study, Henry sat at his desk writing in his journal. The pages were nearly full now, a record, not of transactions or plans, but of thoughts and feelings he once would have dismissed. He paused to look at the small wooden box that rested on the shelf nearby the box that still held Eleanor's letters. He had never moved it. It remained there as a reminder of what silence had cost and what love had repaired. He dipped his pen into the inkwell and began to write slowly, the words flowing with quiet certainty. "If memory is the house of the soul, then love is its light. I have learned that forgetting is not the end of love, only a test of its truth. I once built walls to keep feeling out, believing I was protecting myself. In truth, I was only hiding from life itself. Eleanor taught me that to be loved is not to be owed, but to be seen. I have seen her now, and in doing so, I have seen the man I might yet become." He set down the pen, leaned back in his chair, and let his gaze drift toward the garden outside. Eleanor was there, kneeling among the roses. The sun caught the edge of her hair, turning it to gold. She looked up as if sensing his eyes upon her and smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and sure, and it filled him with the same warmth it always did, the warmth of home. Later that afternoon, as the heat softened into evening, they walked together through the fields beyond the manor. The wheat was tall, rippling like water in the wind. Henry reached for her hand, and she gave it easily. The years that had divided them now seemed like a distant shore behind them. "Do you ever think," he asked softly, "that life gives us more than one chance to begin?" Eleanor looked ahead, her face touched by the last light of the Sunday. "Yes," she said, "but only if we are brave enough to accept it." He smiled. "Then I am grateful for the fall that brought me back to you." "And I," she said, "for the strength to forgive it." They stopped near the edge of the field, where the land sloped gently toward the valley. From there they could see the village below, the smoke from chimneys rising in pale curls. Henry's arm slipped around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, their silhouettes outlined against the glow of dusk. When they returned to the manor, the lamps had been lit. The scent of dinner drifted faintly through the halls. Henry went to his study once more, drawn by the need to finish what he had begun. He took up his pen and wrote a final entry beneath the others. If I forget again, may this page remind me. I have known success, and I have known solitude, but only now have I known peace. Love is not loud. It is the quiet decision to stay, to forgive, to believe even when memory fails. Should the day come when I no longer know my own name, let me still remember hers. Eleanor, the woman who turned duty into devotion, silence into song, and forgetting into grace. He closed the journal and placed it inside the drawer of his desk. When he rose, Eleanor was standing in the doorway, her expression gentle. "You are still working," she said. "Only finishing a thought," he replied. "May I read it someday?" "When the time is right," he said. "But I think you already know what it says." She smiled. "Then come. The night is beautiful." They walked out into the courtyard, where the air was warm and the sky deep with stars. The roses shimmered faintly in the moonlight, their scent drifting through the open doors. Henry looked at her and thought of all the moments that had brought them to this one, the pain, the distance, the fall, the remembering. Each had been necessary, a thread in the tapestry of their shared life. Eleanor reached for his hand, her fingers twining with his. "We have come far," she said. "And yet," he answered, "it feels as though we are only beginning." She laughed softly. "Then let us begin again, every morning, for as long as we can." He kissed her hand. "For as long as I draw breath." They stood there beneath the stars, the sound of the night around them, the garden alive with quiet fragrance. In that stillness, Henry felt the peace he had searched for all his life, not the peace of absence, but the peace of belonging. When at last they returned inside, the house seemed to sigh with contentment, as if even its walls remembered. The candlelight flickered softly across the portraits of their ancestors, who seemed for once to approve. In the upper window of the study, the closed journal waited, the ink still drying upon the final page. It would remain there for years, its message simple and eternal, that memory may fade, but love, once truly known, endures beyond forgetting. And as the night deepened over Ravenshade, Lady Eleanor and Lord Henry slept side by side, their hands still entwined, their hearts steady in the rhythm of a love that had finally, mercifully, found its home.